August 14th, 1943, somewhere in the vast, incomprehensible emptiness of the American Midwest. The heat was a physical presence inside the rattling train car, a suffocating blanket woven from humidity, coal smoke, and the stale scent of fear. From the grimy window, Sister Anneliese Schmidt stared out at a landscape she couldn't believe, a monotonous green canvas that stretched to a horizon so flat and distant it seemed like the edge of the world. For 3 days, the scenery had remained unchanged, an endless ocean of corn and sky that defied the tightly packed, village-dotted geography of her native Saxony. Anneliese, a 21-year-old nurse of the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, had been captured 2 months earlier in the chaos of the Tunis collapse. Since then, her life had been a series of shocks. The shockingly swift surrender, the surprisingly correct treatment by British officers, the terrifying voyage across an Atlantic infested with her own country's U-boats, and now, this journey into the very heart of the enemy nation. She clutched the worn photograph in her pocket, a small, cracked image of her parents and younger brother, standing before the Frauenkirche in Dresden. It was a relic from a world of order, of culture, of destiny. This new world was a void. The other German women in the car, a mix of nurses and Luftwaffe auxiliaries, were mostly silent, their faces drawn and pale beneath a sheen of sweat. What was there to say? Their training, their newsreels, the very air they breathed back home, had prepared them for what was to come. They were prisoners of the Amerikaner, a nation of gangsters, degenerates, and mongrels, as the Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had so clearly explained. They expected brutality. They expected to be treated as spoils of war by undisciplined guards, to be starved and worked to death in squalid camps run by cruel Jewish commandants. Anneliese remembered the newsreels showing German prisoners in Soviet camps, skeletal figures with haunted eyes. She remembered the radio broadcasts describing the lynchings in America's South, the decadent chaos of their cities, the moral rot at the heart of their so-called democracy. Their captors, they were told, lacked the discipline and racial purity of the German soldier. They were a nation of loud, gum-chewing thugs who had stumbled into a war they couldn't possibly understand, a war of ideology and bloodright. The guards on the train had been a confusing prelude. They were older men, reservists with soft bellies and kind eyes, who seemed more bored than menacing. They offered water, and even smiled, a gesture so unnerving in its placid confidence that Anneliese found it more threatening than a scowl. It was the smile of a butcher calming a lamb. This journey was supposed to be her descent into the inferno, the final proof of everything Dr. Goebbels had warned them about. The enemy, having failed to break the will of the German soldier on the battlefield, would now try to break their spirit through humiliation and suffering. Anneliese and her companions had steeled themselves for this. They would remain proud. They would uphold their German dignity. They would show these gangsters what it meant to be women of the Reich, even in chains. But the landscape outside the window offered no hint of the industrial hellscape they anticipated. There were no sprawling, soot-choked factories, no armed guards on every corner, no visible signs of a nation locked in total war. There were only farms, neat, impossibly large farms, each with a sturdy house, a massive red barn, and a towering silo that gleamed in the oppressive afternoon Sunday. The sheer scale of it was stunning. Each farm looked larger than Anneliese's entire home village, and they were empty. For hours they would see no people, only endless rows of corn, the occasional herd of fat, placid cows, and machines that crawled across the fields in the distance, operated by a single person. Where was the struggle? Where was the desperate mobilization she knew from home, the ration cards, the scrap metal drives, the children collecting milk bottle caps for the war effort? This land didn't look like it was at war. It looked like it was asleep, dreaming of abundance. The train's rhythmic clatter began to slow, the screech of brakes pulling Anneliese from her thoughts. A small hand-painted sign drifted past her window. Algona, Iowa. This was it. The name meant nothing, a meaningless collection of syllables from a foreign tongue. But it was to be the site of their ordeal. The women straightened their uniforms, a small, reflexive act of defiance. They smoothed their hair, lifted their chins, and prepared their faces into masks of stoic indifference. The train hissed to a final stop. Heavy doors slid open, flooding the dim car with blinding, white-hot sunlight. Annalise squinted, her hand flying up to shield her eyes. The air that rushed in was thick with the smell of cut grass, manure, and something else, something sweet and savory. It smelled like baking bread. She and the others were herded onto the platform. There were no snarling dogs, no shouting guards brandishing rifles. Instead, there stood a handful of American soldiers, looking more like traffic police than prison guards, and a small group of civilians. Women. They were older, dressed in simple cotton dresses and aprons, their faces weathered by the sun, their hair tied back in practical scarves. They stood with their hands on their hips, watching the Germans with an expression of plain, unadorned curiosity. Annalise had never seen women like them. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with an easy, unhurried confidence. They looked nothing like the painted, promiscuous flappers from the propaganda films. They looked strong. As the German nurses were counted off, one of the American women, a stout figure with flour dusting her forearms, turned to another and said something. Her voice carried across the platform, clear and unconcerned. Annalise, who had a schoolgirl's grasp of English, was stunned by what she heard. The woman wasn't shouting an insult. She wasn't expressing hatred or contempt. She had looked at the weary, terrified German prisoners and said to her friend, "Heavens, they look half-starved. I wonder if they like apple pie." Annalise couldn't believe it. Pie? They were prisoners of war, ideological enemies in a global conflict for the soul of humanity. And this American woman was thinking about dessert. The sheer, baffling absurdity of the moment was a physical blow. It was the first crack in the foundation of her entire worldview. This was not the welcome to hell she had been promised. This was something else. Something far more confusing and, in its own way, far more terrifying. This was the silent, unnerving opening act of a war that America was fighting, which the German High Command never knew existed. It wasn't a war of tanks and bombs, but one of overwhelming, unthinking, and seemingly infinite abundance. The genesis of this bizarre reality was a policy born not of malice, but of cold, hard pragmatism and a uniquely American brand of idealism. In Washington, D.C., the Provost Marshal General's office, tasked with handling the hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war flooding into the country, had made a calculated decision. Citing the Geneva Convention was the official line, but the unofficial strategy was far more ambitious. The United States was facing a critical labor shortage. With millions of men overseas, the nation's farms and factories were desperate for workers. These German prisoners, fit and disciplined, were a perfect solution. But to make them a productive workforce, they needed to be compliant. And the surest path to compliance was not brutality, which would only breed resentment and resistance, but humane treatment. But it went deeper than that. Figures like Eleanor Roosevelt championed the idea that the POW camps could be more than just holding pens. They could be instruments of denazification, not through overt propaganda, which the Germans were conditioned to resist, but through simple exposure. The plan was simple. Let the prisoners see America for themselves. Let them see the well-stocked shelves in the camp canteens, where they could buy Coca-Cola and cigarettes with the scrip they earned from their labor. Let them work on the farms and see the incredible productivity of a free society. Let them interact with ordinary Americans and see that they were not the degenerate monsters of Goebbels' imagination. It was a strategy of psychological warfare, waged with kindness and material plenty. Every hot meal, every clean barracks, every paycheck was a silent argument against the narrative of the Third Reich. The policy's architects understood something the German leadership, blinded by their own ideology, could not. That the most powerful weapon in America's arsenal wasn't its tanks or its bombers, but the simple, undeniable reality of the American way of life. It was a weapon that could not be countered with fanaticism or military discipline. It dismantled an ideology not by attacking it head-on, but by making it seem irrelevant and absurd. Standing on that sun-baked platform in Algona, Iowa, surrounded by the smell of baking and the curious gazes of farm wives, Annalise Schmidt was on the front line of this invisible war. She had been prepared to fight against monsters. She had no idea how to fight against apple pie. The days that followed their arrival at Camp Algona did little to resolve the nurses' profound confusion. They were assigned to the camp hospital, a series of long, single-story wooden buildings that were clean, orderly, and surprisingly well-equipped. Their initial expectation of being put to hard labor in the fields was replaced by the reality of being asked to do the very jobs they were trained for, tending to sick prisoners, maintaining sterile environments, and managing medical supplies. But it was their assignment to the hospital kitchen that became the true battlefield for their souls. The German nurses, led by a stern senior sister named Hild, were accustomed to the German military model of efficiency and austerity. A kitchen was a place of precise measurements and strict rationing, a scientific laboratory for sustaining life with the bare minimum of resources. The kitchen at Algona was something else entirely. It was a cavern of bewildering plenty. Sacks of flour and sugar were stacked to the ceiling. Crates of fresh apples, potatoes, and onions lined the walls. Large, glistening tins of lard and butter sat on shelves next to spices they hadn't seen in years. Cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla. Their first reaction, whispered amongst themselves in rapid German, was cynical mockery. This was a charade. A Potemkin kitchen. It was all for show, a temporary display for a visiting dignitary or perhaps a Red Cross inspection. Any day now, the facade would be stripped away. The real rations would be revealed, watery soup and black bread, and their true ordeal would begin. They performed their duties with a cold, detached professionalism. They scrubbed floors until they shone, peeled potatoes with mechanical speed, and spoke to their American supervisors only when necessary, using clipped, formal English. The supervisors were a group of local women, volunteers from the surrounding farm communities, led by a woman named Mildred Jensen. Mildred was the physical embodiment of the Iowa farm wives they had seen at the train station. 50-something, with a broad, capable frame, hands that were never still, and a face creased with the fine lines of someone who had spent a lifetime smiling into the Sunday. She moved through the kitchen not as a warden, but as the matriarch of an oversized, dysfunctional family. She ignored the German nurse's icy glares and sullen silence, instead offering simple, direct instructions with a patience that was, to them, utterly infuriating. She would correct their work, not with a sharp reprimand, but with a gentle hand guiding theirs, saying, "Here, dear, it's easier if you do it this way." Each dear was like a small, psychological paper cut. It was disarmingly familiar, a word that had no place in the rigid hierarchy of a prisoner of war camp. They couldn't understand her. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't soft. She was simply practical. She had a kitchen to run, and they were the hands she was given to run it. Their ideology was as irrelevant to her as the color of their eyes. The collision came a week into their assignment. The camp was expecting a large shipment of prisoner transfers, and Mildred announced that they would be baking pies for the hospital patients and the new arrivals. The German nurses exchanged looks of disbelief. Pie? For common prisoners? In Germany, such a treat would be reserved for a general's birthday, and even then, it would be a small, modest affair. Hilda, the senior German sister, stepped forward. "We have no recipe for this American pie," she stated, her tone implying that they also had no interest in acquiring one. Mildred simply wiped her hands on her apron and smiled a broad, unflustered smile. "Well then, it's a good day to learn," she said. "Anneliese, you come here. You've got good hands." Anneliese was stunned. She was being singled out. She moved to Mildred's workstation, a massive wooden table dusted with flour, feeling the resentful eyes of the other German nurses on her back. What followed was an hour of the most profound culture shock Anneliese had ever experienced. Mildred began to assemble the ingredients, and Anneliese's professionally trained mind reeled at the criminal extravagance on display. For the crust, Mildred didn't weigh the flour or the lard. She scooped them out with her hands, her movements guided by an instinct that seemed utterly alien. She dumped what looked like a kilogram of pure white sugar into a bowl for the filling, followed by a shocking amount of butter, cut into thick, yellow pats. Anneliese did a quick, silent calculation. The ingredients for this one batch of pies contained more fat and sugar than her family's entire weekly ration back in Dresden. This wasn't just baking, It was an act of obscene wastefulness. It was an insult to the sacrifices of the German people. "Now, you don't want to handle the dough too much," Mildred explained, her voice a low, instructional hum, just enough to bring it together. "You want little bits of that butter still in there. That's what makes it flaky." She showed Annalise how to mix the ingredients with her fingertips, how to add ice water a tablespoon at a time, how the dough should feel cool, pliable, and alive. To Annalise, who was taught that baking was a science of exact ratios, this was chaos. It was primitive. It was the work of a peasant, not a professional. She watched, her expression a careful mask of neutrality, as Mildred peeled and sliced a mountain of apples, tossing them with cinnamon and nutmeg until the air was thick with a warm, spicy perfume that was both intoxicating and deeply unsettling. The German women watched from a distance, their arms crossed, whispering to each other. They were certain this would fail. No proper German baker would ever be so careless, so imprecise. They were watching a demonstration of American incompetence, a perfect example of their decadent, undisciplined nature. Then, the pies went into the massive ovens. A half-hour later, Mildred pulled them out. They were perfect. The crust was a deep, burnished gold, glistening with melted butter and sparkling with crystallized sugar. Thick, syrupy apple filling bubbled up through the vents in the top, releasing a fresh wave of fragrant steam. The sight of them struck the German nurses into a stunned silence. This wasn't the product of chaos. This was artistry. The true shock, the moment that shattered their composure, came next. After the pies had cooled slightly, Mildred cut a large slice from one of them, placed it on a plate, and handed it to Annalise. "Go on, try it," she said. "You can't serve what you haven't tasted." Annalise froze. Eating this pie felt like treason. It felt like accepting the enemy's decadence into her own body. But to refuse would be an act of open insubordination, and she could feel Mildred's impassive, expectant gaze, as well as the curious stares of the other nurses. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the fork. She lifted a small piece to her lips. The crust flaked and crumbled in her mouth, impossibly light and rich with the flavor of butter. Then came the filling. The apples were soft but not mushy, bathed in a warm, sweet, cinnamon-spiced syrup that was a pure, uncomplicated explosion of comfort. It wasn't just food. It was a memory of peacetime, of childhood, of a world without war or rationing or hatred. It was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She looked up and saw the other German nurses watching her, their faces a mixture of envy and suspicion. Mildred, seeing her expression, began cutting slices for all of them. "Don't just stand there gawking," she said, her voice devoid of malice. "Eat." One by one, the other nurses took a plate and, with the same reluctance Annalise had felt, took a bite. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence. The only sound in the kitchen was the soft click of forks against plates. The masks of ideological purity and stoic defiance crumbled. One of the younger nurses, a girl from Hamburg named Erika, began to cry, her shoulders shaking in quiet, gulping sobs. No one moved to comfort her. They were all lost in their own private state of shock. They had been prepared for beatings, for starvation, for cruelty. Their Nazi ideology was a shield built to withstand hatred, but it had no defense against this. How could a nation of gangsters and degenerates, a nation on the verge of collapse as their newspapers claimed, produce something so good, so wholesome? The propaganda had insisted that American strength was a hollow lie, a brittle facade of industrial output with no soul, no culture. But this pie, this simple, rustic dessert made by a common farm wife, was a tangible, edible piece of evidence to the contrary. It spoke of a confidence and an abundance so vast, so effortless, that it made the Reich's frantic, desperate struggle for Lebensraum seem pathetic. In the quiet kitchen of an Iowa POW camp, the Third Reich's narrative of global dominance was being dismantled, one bite of apple pie at a time. The German nurses had come expecting to serve officers. Instead, they had been served a lesson in humility by a weapon they never could have imagined. The shock of that first taste of pie did not fade. It simply changed its nature. What began as a stunning, world-altering event slowly, inexorably, became the new reality. It was not a one-time gesture of goodwill. The German nurses soon learned, to their continued bewilderment, that this was simply how things were done here. The baking of pies, cakes, and breads was not a special occasion. It was a weekly, sometimes daily routine. Mildred Jensen and the other Iowa women had turned the hospital kitchen into an unofficial culinary school, a relentless engine of denazification by butter and sugar. Annalise found herself at the center of this quiet transformation. Mildred, for reasons Annalise couldn't fathom, had taken a special interest in her. She was no longer just peeling potatoes. She was now Mildred's primary apprentice in the art of the American pie crust. The process became a strange, unspoken ritual between them. Mildred would demonstrate, her large, flour-dusted hands moving with an economy of motion that Annalise, the trained nurse, had to admire. She would explain the why behind every step. You use ice water because you want the butter to stay in little pieces. When it hits the hot oven, it makes steam, and the steam makes little pockets. That's your flaky. It was a lesson in physics, delivered in the plain language of a farm kitchen. At first, Annalise resisted internally, performing the tasks with a rigid, detached precision. This was her duty as a prisoner, nothing more. But the dough under her fingertips was an undeniable truth. The science Mildred described worked every single time, slowly, against every instinct of her disciplined German upbringing. Annalise began to feel the process, to understand it not as a list of instructions but as a living thing. She learned to judge the humidity in the air, adding a little less water on a damp day. She learned the feel of a perfectly worked crust, the scent of apples at their peak, the precise golden brown color that signaled perfection. A month after her arrival, she pulled a dozen apple pies from the oven that she had made, from start to finish, by herself. They were flawless. As she set them on the cooling racks, Mildred came over, looked at them, and gave a single, approving nod. "See, you've got the knack," she said, before turning to the next task. In that moment, Annalise felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, something she had been conditioned to believe was a selfish indulgence, pride. She, Annalise Schmidt of Dresden, had mastered this strange, decadent American craft. The thought was immediately followed by a wave of shame. What was she doing? Feeling proud of collaborating with the enemy's culture. But the pride was real as the warm, fragrant pies cooling in front of her. This systematic dismantling of their worldview was not confined to the kitchen. It was happening everywhere, in 1,000 different ways, becoming the inescapable norm for the 400,000 German prisoners held across the United States. While Annalise was learning the chemistry of a flaky crust, Corporal Klaus Richter, a farmer's son from a small village in the Bavarian Alps, was learning a lesson in agricultural physics. Klaus was part of a work detail assigned to a nearby farm owned by a man named Olsen, a quiet, towering Scandinavian American who communicated mostly through gestures. Klaus's family farm in Bavaria was 30 acres of steep, rocky soil, worked by 3 generations of his family with 2 aging draft horses and their bare hands. It was hard, noble work, a testament to the German bond with the soil, the Blut and Boden ideology he had been taught to revere. Olsen's farm was 500 acres of flat, black earth that seemed to stretch into infinity, and he worked it alone. The first day Klaus saw the tractor, he was stunned into silence. It was a John Deere Model A, painted a vibrant, almost cheerful green. It was a monster, a clanking, chugging beast of industrial power that seemed to have been designed for a race of giants. Olsen sat perched atop this machine, casually steering it with one hand, as it pulled a multi-row cultivator that did the work of 50 men with hose. The sound of its 2-cylinder engine, a distinctive pop, 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 became the rhythm of Klaus's days. A constant, thrumming reminder of an industrial power he couldn't comprehend. Each day at noon, a car would drive up the dirt road to the field. It wasn't a military vehicle, it was Olsen's wife, bringing lunch. For Klaus and the other prisoners, who expected a piece of dry bread and a canteen of water, what she brought was a daily miracle. She would lay a blanket on the grass and unload a wicker basket. There were thick sandwiches made with soft white bread, and piled high with roast beef or ham. There were hard-boiled eggs, jars of pickled beets, and a large thermos of coffee, rich with real cream and sugar, and every single day there was dessert. Sometimes it was a chocolate cake, dark and moist. Other times it was a tin of oatmeal cookies, but most often it was pie. Apple, cherry, peach, cut into huge, generous wedges. As Klaus sat in the shade of the tractor, eating a slice of pie so sweet it made his teeth ache, he would look at Olsen. The American farmer wasn't gloating. He wasn't trying to make a point, he was just eating his lunch. This incredible feast wasn't propaganda, it was simply Tuesday. Klaus would think of his father and brothers back in Bavaria, toiling from sunup to sundown, their reward a thin potato soup and the satisfaction of their patriotic duty. He looked at the endless, perfectly cultivated rows of corn, at the gleaming green tractor that did the work of his entire village, at the pie in his hands. The Nazi Party officials had promised them Lebensraum, living space, through conquest. They had promised to seize the fertile lands of the East to feed the German people. Here, in the heart of the enemy nation, was more food than he had ever imagined, produced with an ease that bordered on contemptuous. They didn't need to conquer anyone. They had conquered the earth itself with machines and ingenuity. The ultimate symbol of this new, terrifying reality was found within the camp itself. In a small wooden building with a sign that read, Post-Exchange, the PX. For the German prisoners, it was a temple to a religion they were only beginning to understand, American consumerism. Inside, there were no guards. Only a single, bored-looking corporal behind a counter. And on the shelves behind him was a universe of casual, unbelievable luxury. There were cartons of cigarettes, Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, their colourful packaging, a stark contrast to the drab, state-issued tobacco at home. There were neat stacks of Hershey's chocolate bars and Wrigley's chewing gum. There were magazines filled with glossy, full-colour photographs of impossibly beautiful women, futuristic cars, and gleaming home appliances. And there was Coca-Cola, in its iconic, curved glass bottle, chilled in a metal cooler filled with ice. It was a beverage Anneliese had only ever heard of, a symbol of American decadence. Using the scrip she had earned from her work in the kitchen, she bought a bottle. The corporal opened it for her with a flick of his wrist. She took it outside into the Iowa sun and took a sip. It was sweet, cold and fizzy, a cascade of tiny, sharp bubbles that tickled her nose. It tasted like nothing she had ever experienced. It was utterly frivolous, completely non-essential. And yet, here it was. Mass-produced, affordable, and available to her, a prisoner of war. The existence of this single bottle of soda was a more powerful argument against her entire belief system than any propaganda leaflet. A nation that could afford to devote the industrial resources, the glass, the refined sugar, the complex bottling machinery, the refrigeration, the transportation to produce a frivolous drink for prisoners of war in the middle of a global conflict, was a nation operating on a level of reality her own government could not even conceive of. The Third Reich was melting down church bells to make shell casings. America was chilling soda for its enemies. The pie in the kitchen, the tractor in the field, the Coke in the canteen, these were not isolated shocks anymore. They had merged into a single, overwhelming message, a relentless pattern of evidence. They were the recurring symbols of a power so vast and so deeply ingrained in the fabric of daily life that it needed no armies to express its dominance. The war was not being won on the battlefields of Europe. It was being won here, in the cornfields and kitchens of Iowa, thousands of miles away, in the perpetually smoke-hazed corridors of power in Berlin. The first reports were met with scornful disbelief. The information trickled in not through official channels, but through the heavily censored letters the prisoners sent home and, more alarmingly, through the debriefing of the few wounded soldiers repatriated through neutral countries. At a Gestapo interrogation center, a Hauptmann who had lost both legs in Tunisia and been exchanged via the Red Cross sat before a panel of stern-faced officers. He tried to explain what he had seen. He spoke of the food, the meat, the fresh vegetables, the white bread, the endless coffee. He described the prisoners working on farms, earning wages, and buying cigarettes and candy at a camp store. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that they were often given cake. The senior SS officer on the panel slammed his hand on the table, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "Propaganda," he roared. "They have broken you. You are reciting the lies the Jewish psychologists have fed you." The Hauptmann, a man who had won the Iron Cross for bravery, simply stared back with the dead eyes of someone who had seen a ghost. "It is not propaganda," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is just their reality." This was a threat the German High Command had never anticipated and was uniquely unequipped to fight. How do you counter an enemy whose most effective weapon is the truth? The response from Dr. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda was swift and predictable. They doubled down on the lies. The narrative had to be controlled at all costs. A new wave of propaganda films began to circulate. Newsreels showed grim-faced German soldiers sharing their meager rations with smiling Ukrainian children, a portrait of noble sacrifice. This was contrasted with crudely animated caricatures of American GIs as obese, slobbering gangsters, throwing food away while the world starved. Radio broadcasts warned the German public that any positive reports from prisoners in America were coded messages of distress, or the pathetic ramblings of men whose spirits had been broken by decadent temptation. The American kindness wasn't a sign of strength, it was a perversion, a cowardly attempt to corrupt the pure Aryan soul with sugar and comforts, because they lacked the moral fiber for a true ideological fight. The camp system, they argued, was a vast psychological experiment designed to turn heroic German soldiers into placid, docile cattle. The most desperate countermeasure was aimed at the prisoners themselves. The flow of mail from Germany to the camps in America was weaponized. Letters from home, once a source of comfort, became instruments of psychological torture. They were filled with state-approved narratives of suffering and heroism. A wife would write to her husband in a Texas POW camp. Her letter, guided by the local party official, describing in harrowing detail the latest RAF bombing raid. "The children are brave, but the nights are terrible. We live in the cellar now. Your mother was killed last week when the apartment block was hit. But do not worry for us. We remain strong in our faith in the Führer and final victory. We pray you have not forgotten your duty to us and to the fatherland." The intent was clear: to infect the comfortable American camps with the misery of the homeland, to instill a burning sense of guilt, to remind the men that while they were eating pie, their families were being incinerated. But this strategy produced a result the propagandists never intended. It backfired spectacularly. For a man like Klaus Richter, sitting in the shade of Olsen's John Deere tractor after a lunch of roast beef sandwiches and cherry pie, a letter describing the firebombing of Hamburg didn't fill him with a renewed will to fight. It filled him with a cold, sickening rage at the incompetence of the government that had failed to protect his family. His immediate reality, the safety, the order, the impossible abundance, was a constant, undeniable rebuke to the chaos and destruction his leaders had brought upon his own people. The propaganda was a distant, screeching voice, but the pie in his hand was real. The well-fed farmer sitting beside him was real. The quiet, peaceful fields were real. The cognitive dissonance was a crushing weight. His government had promised him glory and given his family death from the skies. The enemy gave him a full belly and a safe place to sleep. The Reich's desperate counter-propaganda couldn't compete with lived experience. It was like trying to convince a man standing in a rainstorm that he was perfectly dry. The psychological impact on the prisoners was devastating, an unraveling of the soul that no amount of prior indoctrination could prevent. They began to refer to their situation with a new, darkly ironic term, der Goldene Käfig, the golden cage. They were trapped, but their cage was comfortable, even pleasant. This comfort was a more effective form of torture than any physical abuse. It stripped them of their most potent psychological weapon, their sense of righteous victimhood. It was impossible to feel like a noble martyr for a great cause when the enemy was teaching you how to make a perfect lattice crust. The quiet, relentless kindness and the overwhelming material superiority didn't just break their morale, it hollowed it out, replacing fervent belief with a weary, cynical apathy. For Anneliese in the Algona hospital kitchen, the unraveling was a deeply personal crisis. She received a letter from her mother in Dresden. Much of it was blacked out by censors, but the words that remained painted a terrifying picture. Food is difficult, the nights are long, we pray for your brother on the Eastern Front, remember your duty. Anneliese read the letter standing in the kitchen, the air thick with the warm, yeasty smell of cinnamon rolls rising in their pans. She looked at her own hands, no longer the pale, slender hands of a city nurse, but stronger now, dusted with flour, the hands of a baker. She felt a profound and dizzying sense of dislocation. Who was she? Was she the loyal daughter of the Reich, starving with her people in a righteous war? Or was she this new person, this expert pie maker, safe and well-fed in the heart of the enemy's empire? The propaganda from home demanded she feel guilt. Instead, she felt a quiet, simmering anger. The duty her mother spoke of felt like a distant, abstract concept. Her immediate duty was the 30 apple pies that needed to be in the oven in the next hour. This new duty was tangible, it was productive, it resulted in something good and nourishing. The duty to the Reich had resulted in her brother freezing in Russia and her mother cowering in a cellar. The German High Command had prepared its soldiers and citizens to die for their country. They had prepared them to endure starvation, brutality, and defeat. They had never, in their wildest, most paranoid delusions, prepared them for the possibility that the enemy would simply be better. Better at farming, better at organizing, better at baking, and, in a way that defied all logic, better at being humane. They had built an entire worldview on the idea of their own superiority, and it was now collapsing under the weight of 1,000,000 apple pies. They had no countermeasure for that. The final verdict on the Third Reich's ideological war against America was delivered not by a general or a statesman, but by the relentless humming machinery of the American economy itself. The pie was never just a pie. The John Deere tractor was never just a piece of farm equipment. The ice-cold Coca-Cola was never just a beverage. They were the sacraments of a different kind of faith, the tangible output of a system that the German leadership, in their obsession with martial glory and racial purity, had fundamentally misunderstood. They believed power grew from the barrel of a gun and the will of a unified folk. They never considered that true, sustainable, world-altering power grew in the endless, fertile fields of Iowa, was forged in the competitive fires of Detroit's assembly lines, and was expressed in the simple, revolutionary act of a farm wife having enough sugar to bake a pie for a prisoner of war. This was the macro theme, the grand strategic truth that played out in miniature in every POW camp across the nation. Germany had re-engineered its entire economy for a singular purpose: total war. It was a marvel of terrifying efficiency, but it was brittle. It was a predator, designed for a short, violent hunt, needing to constantly conquer and consume to sustain itself. The American system was something else entirely. It was an ecosystem. It was a decentralized, chaotic, consumer-driven behemoth that, when finally stirred to action, revealed a productive capacity that defied belief. The same companies that had perfected the mass production of refrigerators and family sedans turned their ingenuity to building tanks and bombers with an ease that stunned their enemies. John Deere, the maker of Olson's gentle green tractor, was also producing transmissions for M3 tanks and aircraft parts. The Hershey Company, whose chocolate bars were a staple in the Camp PX, was also producing the high-energy D-ration for every GI's field pack. The factories of the American heartland were simultaneously fueling a global war on two fronts and maintaining a standard of living at home that was, to the rest of the world, the stuff of fantasy. This was the source of the abundance that so shattered the prisoner's worldview. It wasn't a propaganda trick. The country was not putting on a show for them. Incredibly, this was America on a war footing. This was the nation with its belt tightened. The prisoners looked at the bounty around them and were stunned to learn that this was what Americans considered rationing. The sheer scale of it was a weapon against which there was no defense. The German war machine was a closed system, consuming its own people and resources until it collapsed. The American war machine was an open system, a fountain of material that seemed to have no bottom, effortlessly producing both the tools of destruction and the comforts of home in parallel. The ultimate demonstration of this victory, the moment the golden cage became a final tomb for their ideology, came on May 8, 1945. At Camp Algona, the prisoners were assembled in the main yard, the same dusty space where they had first been counted off as terrified newcomers. The spring sun was warm, and the air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and lilacs from a nearby farm. An American major, a man they rarely saw, stood on the steps of the administration building, holding a piece of paper. The chalky dust on his boots and the weary set of his shoulders were the only signs that this was not a routine day. He cleared his throat, and in the flat, unemotional tone of a man reading a logistics report, he announced that the German High Command had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The war in Europe was over. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the assembled men and women. There were no cries of anguish, no shouts of defiance. There was only the rustle of the wind in the cottonwood trees and the distant, rhythmic pop-pop-pop of a tractor working in a field. Anneliese stood among the other nurses, her hands tucked into the pockets of her apron. She looked at the faces around her, the hardened soldiers of the Afrika Korps, the arrogant young Luftwaffe pilots, the stoic nurses who had once sneered at Mildred Jensen's methods. Their faces were blank, hollowed-out masks of disbelief. They looked like a people who had just been told their God was dead. The news was not a liberation. It was an amputation. The ideology, the cause, the belief in their own superiority that had defined their entire existence, was gone. It had not been defeated. It had been rendered irrelevant, proven to be a catastrophic, murderous lie. In its place was nothing. Just the vast, indifferent blue of the Iowa sky. The American guards watched them, not with triumph, but with a kind of weary pity. After a few minutes, the major dismissed the prisoners. The show was over. They shuffled away, not to their barracks to weep or rage, but back to their work details, because the work was the only thing left that made sense. Klaus Richter went back to Olsen's farm and finished cultivating the last 10 acres of corn. Anneliese Schmidt went back to the hospital kitchen. The lunch schedule had not been cancelled. There were 24 rhubarb pies that needed to be baked. As she rolled out the dough on the familiar flour-dusted table, her movements now as instinctive as breathing, she realized the terrible, profound truth. The surrender of Germany meant almost nothing to her daily life. Her world was no longer Dresden or the fatherland. Her world was this kitchen. Her purpose was no longer serving the Reich. Her purpose was creating a perfectly flaky crust. The skill she had learned here, the tangible, useful craft taught to her by her captors, was now more real and more valuable than the nursing degree that bore the seal of a nation that no longer existed. In the epilogue to the great, terrible story of the Second World War, the fate of these prisoners was a final, quiet testament to the nature of the American victory. When the time came for repatriation, a stunning number of them did not want to leave. They had seen the letters from home, the photographs of their ruined cities. They had tasted freedom, even inside a prison camp, and found it preferable to returning to the rubble of a failed ideology. Many, like Klaus Richter, eventually found a way to emigrate back to the United States, trading the memory of a 30-acre farm in the Alps for the reality of a 500-acre farm in the Midwest. They vanished into the great, absorbent fabric of American life. Anneliese Schmidt was repatriated to the British zone of occupied Germany in 1946. She found Dresden to be a ghost city, a landscape of skeletal ruins where her family's apartment building once stood. Her parents were dead. Her brother had vanished somewhere near Stalingrad. The world she had been fighting for was a graveyard. She worked for a time in a Red Cross hospital, a place of true hardship and starvation that made Camp Algona seem like a luxury resort in her memory. In 1949, using a connection with a church that had sponsored her, she applied for and was granted a visa to the United States. She returned to Iowa. She married a quiet man who had served in the Pacific and had no desire to ever speak of the war again. They bought a small farm, She raised 3 children who grew up speaking English without a trace of an accent, who pledged allegiance to the American flag, and who knew Germany only as the place their mother came from a long time ago. Sometimes, on holidays, when her grandchildren would visit, she would teach them how to bake. She would show them the secret of using ice water and not overworking the dough. And as she watched their small hands covered in flour, she would feel the last ghosts of her old life finally fade away. The Third Reich had promised its people a glorious empire built on conquest and racial destiny. It lasted 12 years and left behind a continent in ruins. The American Republic offered nothing but the chaotic, unpredictable pursuit of happiness. Its victory was not in the cities it bombed, but in the enemies it quietly, almost unconsciously, absorbed. German nurses had arrived on a train in 1943, expecting to serve officers and steeling themselves for the brutality of monsters. They were met instead by Iowa farm wives, who were stunned they looked so hungry. They had come to serve a master race, but were taught instead to bake pies. And in that simple, generous, and overwhelmingly powerful act, an empire of blood and iron was undone by a republic of apple pie.